be seated. So we're in the season after the Epiphany. So this season of Epiphany, if you will. Epiphany means to shine the light or to reveal. And so in this season, we're discovering who it is that Jesus is. So he's born as a baby, and then he's baptized, and we celebrate those things on Christmas and Epiphany. And then in this season, his revealing happens to us, because to outward appearances, he looks just like an ordinary guy. And so we have to see what he does and what he says in order to be able to know more about what's inside of him. So he reveals himself during this time. And if we watch him, then we'll be surprised by him, because he takes us by surprise. Jesus always takes us by surprise. And so if we watch him and he doesn't surprise us, then that means we're missing something. And so that's the case this morning. And I have to say, in part, the gospel stories are so familiar to us that we don't get surprised by them. That we just kind of, that's it. So it's the calling of the first disciples, from fishermen and all of that. We've known those stories from the time that we were young, if you were raised in the church. But if you had been back in Jesus' time and you had heard this story, you'd have said, what? Jesus did what? They did what? And so we have to kind of go back and set the context a little bit so that we can kind of get there. So we need to understand a little bit more about what it meant to be a rabbi and what it meant to be a disciple of a rabbi or a follower of a rabbi. So in their context, which is different than ours. So I just read a survey recently, and it was most respected people kind of roles and responsibilities. And clergy in our culture are kind of just under journalists, kind of down on the list. And if you ask me, it's deserved. Right? So to be aware of the status of clergy, but during the time of Jesus, so there's this Jewish community, and for their survival, they depend on the teaching of the law and being people of the law. So who are their heroes? Their heroes are the people who teach the law. They are the rock stars. So if you have a son who's growing up, and the question is, what do you want him to become? And if it's to make the NFL draft or it's to be a rabbi, it's not hard to decide that. It's to become a rabbi, because everybody respects you. Everybody is just like, wow, that's the coolest thing. It's hard to imagine being the coolest thing, sitting and studying the Bible and kind of figuring all that stuff. But it's the coolest thing for them. And so then there were a lot of people, because of the status associated with it, there were a lot of people who wanted their sons to become rabbis. And so there was a vetting process. So rabbis didn't go out looking for students. They didn't have time, because they were buried in fathers and mothers bringing their sons to them to become rabbis. And so most of the time they didn't make the cut. And so there was this winnowing process, and it started very young. So we'll just talk about it at the beginning of that process. So it's when you're 6 years old. So think about the kids that we just sent off for Sunday school, right? So about 6 years old. And so elementary school for them, the equivalent of elementary school, if the rabbi said, you're bright, you're sharp, you show potential. You're not in, but you show potential. And so they would say, come in and let your son study with us. If not, if they weren't bright and didn't show the potential, if they weren't the best of the best in terms of breeding, they would say, just take your boy home. Take your boy home. Let him learn your father's, your father's trade. Let them have have lots of babies, and pray that one of their babies will become a rabbi. Right? So 6 years old, they get into what's kind of elementary school, and they have one job, one thing to learn. So this is from 6 years old until about 10. And their job is to learn the Torah, is to learn the scriptures. And so I have here a Hebrew Bible, all right? And so we're talking about the first 5 books of the Old Testament, all right? So it's about this much. So their job from 6 to 10 is to memorize this thing. To memorize it. So if I asked people to stand up and recite for me the Declaration of Independence, how many people could do that? Not many. And yet they lived in a time of scrolls, hand-copied scrolls, and if the rabbis are going to know Scripture, be the teachers of Scripture, they're going to know Scripture. And so for us, it's like we don't memorize hardly anything. I forget my phone number. They memorized it so that by the time they're done, the rabbi says to them, "Okay, give me the first chapter of the book of Exodus," and they could rattle it off. They could quote a passage, and the student ought to be able to quote the verse before and the verse afterwards. Right? So they know it. They got it down cold. And so remember, the rabbi is testing them all along. And so now they get, if they make it that far, and if they're going to be successful, and they show promise, then the rabbi says, "Okay, you can go on to the next level." If not, if they kind of don't make the cut, then they go back home and they learn whatever their father's trade was. And so if they go on, then from the ages of 10 to 14, they learn the rest of it. Memorize it. Know it. So that the rabbi can quote a passage or a verse, and they can quote the verses immediately before it, immediately afterwards, say it backwards. All kinds of ways of being able to know completely. Kyle, what do you think? To know completely what's in this book. And so when a lot of times when we see in the Gospels people naming a passage or quoting something from the Old Testament, they're just assuming that the audience would have known this, that they would be able to know. So they just have to say a couple words, and they know that the people who were in the rabbis and who were teaching would have known the entire passage. So then it gets to the time of them being 14, and so now there are more tests and more questions. And so then if they are the best, if they are not just the best, but the best of the best, if they are the cream of the crop and sharp, now they go into the next piece, which is to learn about the commentary of the rabbis on the Bible. And so we all know that. So there are 613 commands in the Bible, and so we know you're supposed to keep the Sabbath. Well, so what does keeping the Sabbath mean? How far can you walk? Can you walk 10 feet? Can you walk a mile? How far can you walk? Or lighting a match or kindling a fire, is that work? And so the rabbis would debate all of those things. And so from 14 on, the students would go through all of these interrogations, and there would be questions and answers. They're just kind of the rabbi would be pushing and shoving in order to be able to find out who was the best to be able to hand on his legacy, because he's proud of those who will go on and become his students. And at this point, it gets to the end, and there are a majority of the students who still can't cut it. And so they get cut, And finally, there is the best of the best of the best of the best, the cream of the cream of the cream of the crop. And those are the ones who go on to be with this rabbi. Those are the rabbis that Jesus was dealing with. Those are the teachers of the law, the students who grew up in that system. So now, Jesus comes. And what they understand is the keeping of the law and the demands of the law and what it means to be people of the law. And Jesus is now the new rabbi. And when he begins his ministry, how many students are waiting in line to go study under him? There are none. Nobody's bringing their kids to him. Jesus goes out and finds the ones he wants to have as his students. And who does he choose? 6-year-old boys? These are guys who are plying the trade of their father, right? They are fishermen. They tried. Every boy tried to make the cut. They didn't make the cut. They said, go home, make babies, and pray that your son will become a rabbi. They didn't make the cut. And yet Jesus goes out, these probably young but older than little guys, and finds them and chooses them. You did not choose me, Jesus said. You did not choose me, but I chose you. And so then he creates this community of people where all of a sudden those who are rabbis, those who are teachers, are not the cream of the cream of the cream of the cream of the crop, but all of a sudden are from the community of people who live as people of faith in the community, that are like the other people who are in the community. And to be able to learn then what this new kingdom is all about. What are the principles of this new kind of kingdom? How is it that just anybody can enter into this new kind of living? And so the character of the church becomes all of a sudden opened to anyone who hears the call and yearns to be a part of it. Anyone who hears the call and yearns to be a part of it. And so there are no experts in Jesus' kingdom. There are no masters of the body of teaching. There are only open hearts in a community where we come together and live together to experience the presence of Jesus in our lives. And we learn in community what it means to live like Jesus. Let me tell you one of the most important teachers for me. His name was Robert. This was my last church. I was there for 14 years. So Robert, I first remember him. He's an African-American guy with a beard. And he loved to crucifix. So this is a large church. And he loved to have the cross in his hands. And he was just absolutely straight posture, much better than mine. Absolutely straight posture. And he would hold the cross. And it was just like he was marching up to meet the Queen of England. And it was just this dignity about him. Robert had grown up in the neighborhood as an African-American young man, and with his brother had dyslexia, and so had a hard time in school. He went through the special education program through elementary school and junior high, and then finally, when he started high school, couldn't hack it anymore, and so dropped out. He was drafted into the Vietnam War, and as an African-American poor guy in Vietnam, he saw more than any 10 men ought to ever see. And so his way of coping with it was drugs, to kill the emotion and the pain. And so he came back as a drug addict and lived on the streets. And so people would see him in the neighborhood. And in the place where he grew up, a member of our church saw him and recognized him and invited him to come to church. And so he did. He came in, and then he started coming more, and then he got involved in the recovery movement, and he met Jesus, and his addiction was broken. It never was not a struggle for him. It always was a struggle for him. He died 2 years ago. So it's still an emotional thing for me. It never was not a struggle for him. But he was, as I think about people who I knew in that church, he was passionate about Jesus. He knew that Jesus could change people's lives. He knew that healing could happen. He knew that there was nobody who was beyond hope. And he went to bat for them. And in his inarticulate ways, in his grammar screwed up, he would do whatever it was that he could do to attract attention. In fact, it became my job as assistant rector in that place to sit next to him at the annual meeting, because at the annual meeting, there's an open microphone, and he would want to dominate and talk about the poor, about people who are homeless, and especially about violence and guns. Those were his issues. And so I'd let him go on for a while, but then we needed to kind of sit on him so we could get the business done. But he was a passionate lover of Jesus. I took a lot of seminary classes with a lot of really smart people, Harvard and Yale grads. Nobody taught me as much as Robert did. This kingdom that Jesus brings is a kingdom in which our lives are altered, changed, set free. It's a calling that reaches out to each one of us. But as we're prepared to surrender, as we're prepared to listen, as we're prepared to slow down and take the time enough to hear and even identify the crying in our own hearts, and to want Jesus to touch it and to make us whole. Jesus is about the calling of the elite and the smart and the cream of the crop, but because they need healing too. They're just as much prisoners as everyone else. And so this opportunity to be able to come, to be surprised by what it is that Jesus does, to know that life as we experience it is not necessarily what Jesus has in mind for us, that it could be bigger and there could be unexpected things that he has for us if we will but just slow down, take the time, listen, and connect with people who sometimes can look scary or threatening to us. So, here at St. Mary's, we're in kindergarten. We're just beginning, because that's as far as you get. You can be living your life following Jesus, and you never get past the stage of just beginning. And so we hang together as a community, and we support each other and love each other, and take the time, because that's when Jesus is able to come and call us. Thanks be to God. Thank you for being here. Amen. So let's stand together and affirm the faith of our hearts and our